very warm welcome to Vontobel Asset Management's Investment Conference for 2014. The focus this year is very much on emerging markets and the drivers of growth. And we are very lucky this year to have a very distinguished guest joining us, Professor Anil Gupta from the University of Maryland, who's very much an expert, joins me now. It's a pleasure to have you on board.
Delight.
Very nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Professor, you talk an awful lot about the diverging futures
Yes.
of emerging market economies. What do you mean by that?
Essentially what it is that in emerging economies, their evolution is like on an S-curve. So therefore, there's a certain set of reforms which get the emerging economies moving, and then there is a serious risk that they become complacent. And when they become complacent, then in fact, leadership plays a huge role in terms of whether there are the next set of reforms or not. And some emerging markets, they get trapped into basically the previous paradigm and are not able to make the shift to the next set of reforms. And that's what I mean by emerging markets, diverging futures.
So when we're looking across the whole panoply of emerging market economies, what sparks your excitement at the moment? Where are the growth potentials?
Yeah, I think if I look at emerging economies, and particularly if I look at the 10 largest emerging economies that I focus on very much, and the 10 largest would, go all the way from Poland and Russia, China, and so on. And of course, China is the biggest emerging market, India, all the way to Nigeria, and Indonesia. So if I look at all the 10 biggest emerging markets, the hottest right now, in my view, would be India and Indonesia, followed by Nigeria. China, of course, has been a very hot economy. It's been the hottest emerging market, but China is seriously slowing down. And it's hard to imagine how it can go back to, forget about 8%, 9%, 10% growth, but even to sustain a 7% growth rate for China would be very difficult. Emerging markets that are in serious trouble right now would be countries like Russia, like Brazil.
So why are you so excited, Professor, about India and Indonesia?
The reason for that is that India and Indonesia, they both actually, first, they're starting from a lower base. So the per capita income in India and Indonesia is significantly lower, for example, than China, Russia, or Brazil. So a lower base means that they have significant upside. So that's number one. Number two is that both actually India and Indonesia, they had recent elections, and the countries were lucky, the populations were lucky that the leaders that were elected, Narendra Modi in India, Jokowi in Indonesia, are actually reformers. And in particular, Modi in India has a strong track record, and he's a tough leader. So therefore, the upside for India right now looks very good.
Professor, let's have a look at a long-term outlook for emerging markets. In terms of long-term growth, where do you think that growth is going to come from? And are you still optimistic about that growth potential?
Yeah, I think, the days of 10% growth are gone. But if emerging markets can continue to grow at about 6%, that still would be phenomenal. Because, you see, it's hard to imagine how the rich economies grow at more than 2% a year. And so emerging markets growing at 6 is still 3 times that of the developed economies. Among the emerging economies, the EM10, the 10 biggest ones, I think the likelihood of the fastest growth rate would be India, Indonesia, and Nigeria. Countries that look like having the slowest growth rate over the next several years would be definitely Russia. I would put in that bucket, possibly Brazil. But Brazil is going to have elections, and we have to see if Dilma Rousseff, wins the elections again, or Marina Silva, who is looking like the favorite right now, is the new leader. Because if it is Marina Silva, I think that will be a nice plus for Brazil.
Professor, let's have a look at some individual sectors now, rather than just the economies on the overall. Again, which sectors do you think have the most potential, particularly if we compare emerging markets to industrialized countries and where they have a competitive advantage?
I think, if you look at over the last 10, 15 years, The sectors which really have been high growth sectors and have played a major role for emerging economies have been commodities. But that's, what I would say hugely is a China effect. And so as China grew, built its infrastructure, demand for commodities, whether it's from Brazil or much of Latin America, Africa, so that was a huge part. I think those days are pretty much gone. So if I look ahead at the next 10 years, the biggest growth potential actually would be in manufacturing sectors, by and large, in manufacturing sectors, and in particular, manufacturing that is driven not so much by export orientation, but that is driven by domestic demand. Domestic demand in India, in Indonesia, in Nigeria. So I would be looking at industrial sectors, manufacturing sectors, particularly those that are driven by domestic consumption.
Well, Professor Anil K. Gupta, a fascinating insight. Thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you, Emma. Pleasure.